well, I'm not going to get too into it because this is going to be kind of a different video. We're making it mostly for video purposes, though I am live, so if people come in and there's some chats, we'll be responding to those as well. As much as things are going to be different today, some things remain the same, which is I still have my tea. As you can even see the steam, so it's quite hot. I'm not gonna take a sip out of it yet. This is kind of a Middle Eastern blend. Oh, hey, Cyber Sandwich. Thanks for coming in. As I say, today's gonna be pretty different. Um, how do I explain this? Basically, there was an instance where I was asked to, you know, kind of give a presentation about something I know really well, and I wanted to capture something that, in a lot of ways, my channel is really here to be about, which is that people struggle a lot when it comes to understanding arguments, to hearing what people say and understanding how they mean it and what they're trying to express. That skill is incredibly important. When it comes to argumentation, I think it might be more important than expressing yourself well, though it's kind of close. And while when people are getting better at arguing, they put a lot of effort into better expressing their ideas, better putting how it is they mean to say things. And in fact, even in like philosophy classes, they teach you like how to present an argument in like a line by line fashion so you understand it. What Okay, that's cool and all, but if you can't understand what other people are saying and how they mean it, you're gonna make a lot of mistakes. And I don't think that this is the kind of thing that it's pretty rare that someone will be completely off base unless they're acting in bad faith. But minor differences have massive impacts as well. And learning to comb through those and pick out what people are actually trying to say is really important. And so I made this presentation, and it was like half, it was kind of joking when I made it. So a lot of this is going to be a little silly, but the there was an I was asked to there was a situation where I was presenting this and someone asked me if I had this as a video anywhere that he could show to people. And so that's what today is. That's what we're going to be doing. We're going to go through this, and it's going to be a little weird because it's a slideshow presentation. Like I'm doing a PowerPoint kind of thing. I don't normally do that, and what's in here is very planned and it's been thought out ahead of time, as opposed to trying to watch videos and interpret them on the fly. So that all being said, I think we can get into it. One of the unfortunate side effects of this being a slideshow is I'm not going to be able to see chat, but that's fine. We'll get on just fine without it. So I will like I guess I'll try to look at chat every now and again just to make sure. And let's get into it. All right. Let me just make sure that yeah, we're looking at the right thing. Cool. So as I say, we're going to be looking at reading arguments and trying to figure out what people are saying, what people say without saying it. Now, I don't mean that we're going to be trying to decipher hidden codes of like, oh, they don't mean this or whatever, but oftentimes people will say a part of a thought and imply the rest of it. So there's going to be a lot of that. There is a disclaimer that comes with this, and that is, unfortunately, this isn't actually exactly what I wanted to talk about. This doesn't do. Um, I hope this. I do hope this helps you get better at reading arguments in real time, but it doesn't do what I was hoping it would. At least I don't think so. If that's not, if you find that this is helping you in what I described, then great. Please let me know. But what I wanted was for people to be able to, in conversations with their friends or family or whatever else, be able to understand better what they're trying to say. And unfortunately, looking at specific moments of non-understanding is hard to do when you're looking for them. This is why I so often do debate reviews on this channel, where I get to find them as they come up, as opposed to trying to like think back of like where there were instances of that. It's just really hard to do so. So this is going to be a little different than what I want, but hopefully it'll still be helpful. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be listening with a purpose. We're not just, having a conversation and listening to the other person, whatever. We are setting out goals of what we want to try to accomplish with what we're listening. And while I understand that that can color a little bit of how your approach is, it also means that some of how it will do that is going to be towards a better understanding of what's going on. And there are a few things we're going to be looking for. So we have some goals here. By the way, I often in conversation have goals for what I want, and while that might seem weird and I guess robotic in a sense, I think I don't think that's necessarily wrong to do. Oftentimes that goal is I want to have fun in the conversation, enjoy someone's company or whatever. But sometimes I want them to maybe know how much I appreciate what they did, or maybe I want them to, or I want to better understand a thought they have, or whatever else. These aren't necessarily manipulative goals, and in the same way, just like I often speak with a purpose, I'm also going to be listening with a purpose, and that's what we're going to be trying to do here. So we have some goals. We're going to try to hear what people are saying and what they're not saying. And that is, there are two versions of that not saying. There's what they're implying and just aren't saying out loud but still mean, and then there's also they do not mean this. Do not assume that they are saying this. Both are difficult, and like with everyone else, I think I am self-taught in this regard, even though I have a history of doing debate or whatever. I don't think I am like perfect at this. It's just a skill I seem to have at the very least better aptitude for than a lot of other people. Hopefully you can learn from me, and if someone knows better than me, learn from them too. And if that person is you, well, good for you. We're also going to be trying to understand why someone say what they did, how they did. And there are two kinds of why. This is really important. I think I've mentioned this on the channel before. It's something I got from Lawrence Krauss, and I think it's really insightful. There's a why where you ask, how come? By what means did this become the case? So, for example, if someone says something extremely racist, you might want to ask, how did it come to be the case that they would think this way? Right? How, were they raised in a racist society? Things like that. We're not going to do too much like deep diving on that. We're not going to be looking at that far back, but that kind of sense of like what led them to this point where they're saying this and why they're saying it in this way. For example, the how come for this presentation is I noticed a lot of people struggle with listening, and it seems like I do better at it than most. It's to the point where I've had a lot of conversations and arguments with friends where I'm listening to two people argue and I'm translating arguments between them because they're not understanding what the other person is saying. They're not interpreting it correctly. That can be a how come, right? But then there's also the what for. And that is why in the sense that we often mean why. For what reason was this done? In this case, okay, why is this presentation? It is for the reason that I want people to be better at this, and I was specifically asked, and it's for the purpose of hoping to improve people's ability and like help people learn how to do this better. We're going to be looking for these in these statements, and while I might not be going over all of these goals individually for each of the things that we're going to, each of the examples we're going to have, think about it, and you can go over this video again and think about it more if you find more information, more details, more information that we might have missed, because people say a lot in the small amount of words that they use. This should also inform us on how to respond. If the what for includes, for example, they are attempting to deceive me or someone else, that should inform how you respond to people. This is what makes for people having being bad interlocutors sometimes, is that they're just responding like, oh, it doesn't, what the person says, I'm just responding like they're anyone else. But no, why they're getting there, what they're doing, the reasons they're saying these things, it's important to respond appropriately. It doesn't really make sense for you to, for example, like spout off you know, 10 minutes of FBI statistics when your racist uncle is shouting at Thanksgiving. That's just not what we're there for. That's just not an appropriate response, and he's not listening. So don't do that. There's also, and this comes back a little bit to like what our goals are when we speak to people. We're not going to talk about that a lot, but remember, like, informing how to respond should also have to do with what your goals are. With your racist uncle, like, I don't know, man. I don't know that you're going to change his mind. If if you are, that's cool, and that can be your goal. And if you can, and if you feel that you can't, then maybe your goal should just to be to come off as maybe your goal should be to de-escalate the situation, get along with your family, not turn this into the rest of the evening we're shouting at each other. These are the kinds of goals you can have. We're going to be looking for a couple of things. A couple of these are debate terms that we've discussed in the past, but I'll go over more. And some of these are we haven't talked about previously on the stream. One of those is the warrant. This is something I've talked about before when it comes to debate stuff. Warrant is what is the justification for this statement. Now, in debate, that ought to be something that actually justifies it, but not. People aren't debating when they talk, when you argue with people. Even in debates, people often aren't approaching it in that way. There will be a reason, but it's not necessarily a justifiable reason. So try to look under the hood, try to find what is the reason for what they're talking about. What is their warrant? And the question you can ask yourself always, this is a really, really important question, because sometimes their warrant will not be true. Like the thing that justifies their statement is just false. But they still said it. So one way you can get to this warrant is to ask yourself, what would have to be true? What would the world have to look like for this statement to make sense? Because to them, it probably did. Most people, when they say things because it makes sense for them to say. It's very, very rare that someone will say something for no reason whatsoever, even to themselves. And we can try to figure out what their reasoning is. Why did they think that this was important to say? And what justifies the statement to them? Now, even with a bad faith interlocutor, there are reasons they'll say it. It just might not be that it's true or it's justified by reality. We're not going to deal with that too much, but just things to keep in mind. We're also going to be looking for impacts. Impacts is another debate concept. Is basically, why does this matter? And the why it matters is going to, well, we'll get to what that points to later. But the why it matters is massively important, and you should be asking yourself why it matters to them and why they think it should matter to you. This is also important for anything you say, but we're going to be focusing on listening, not speaking in this case, not making an argument, but interpreting one. And the last thing is actually something I added right before I came on stream to do this, which is we're going to be looking at connotative versus denotative meaning. So if you're not familiar with the terms, denotative meaning is the definition of a word as written. It is what what it literally means, as compared to connotative meaning, which is how we interpret what it means, the sense we get from it, even if the word literally does not mean anything different. A really good example is the word rhetoric. Most usage of the word rhetoric by like lay people, as I understand, is that it is in some way deceitful. It is some way dishonest. In debate, it just in like philosophy, it just means the way you say something. That's the literal denotative meaning. But the connotative meaning is that if you say someone is engaging in rhetoric, is that they're being dishonest. Is that what they're doing is in some way verbal trickery. And that is implied even though the word doesn't literally mean that. So always be on the lookout for what is implied by the specific term usage. There are a lot of alternatives to words in English, which is pretty great. You can use different things to mean different things. Another one, different terms to mean the same thing. And often the decision to do that is based on its connotative meaning. A good example is also like, if I say, oh, I got a couple of things from the store, as opposed to a few things from the store, as opposed to a bunch of things from the store, they could all, like, because they're all hazy, they could all mean like 4 items. But there's an implication if I say a couple that it's fewer than if I say a bunch. You know what I mean? And by making that decision of which word to use, I'm implying something. I'm giving you an impression. So we're going to be looking for that as well. So the first example is going to be easy mode. Around here, we're going to be assuming a lot of left-leaning worldviews because I have those views. And when I made this, it was for an audience that I knew would be on board with me because we had just watched a documentary on this exact subject. From here on, if it's something written in white, that is the example that we are going to be analyzing. And if it's written in red, that's probably a contrast, something that will make it easier to understand by giving a counterexample. So here's the easy mode, a statement with which I agree. People of color are disproportionately incarcerated in the United States. One thing to note about this is, well, I said I agree with it, but isn't this a descriptive claim? It is. It is only stating that this is something true. And if that is factually supported, then how can you agree with it? And it should make sense to some people already that it would be reasonable to say you agree or disagree with this statement, even though there's not really anything to do. If someone said they disagree, that would feel weird, but you understand that some people will disagree with this, and some people will agree with it like I do. And we'll get to why that is in a second. There's also an implication of importance going on here. This is a lot due to word choice. We're going to contrast this with another version of this statement that I disagree with, which is, despite making up only 13% of the population, black people commit 50% of the violent crime. Now, of course, when this is stated, put in these words, the term black people is not often black people, but I softened it slightly. This is a statement with which I disagree, but notice this is also a descriptive claim and of the same thing. We're talking about the same thing in both of these statements, but one is agreeable and one is not. Why? We'll get to that. Because these don't say the same thing. They are describing the same set of facts, but they are not saying the same thing whatsoever. And this is why I wanted this to be the first example. There are ways that you can change what you say that change the meaning of it, even if you're describing the same thing. And the same is the case with these. Notice, so now we can talk a bit about what the differences are. Why do they say something different? One, you can look at word choice. People of color versus black people are very often they'll just say blacks, or it'll be a slur of some kind. It tells you something about the person who's stating it. Someone who's going to say people of color is probably not attributing malice. But there is a little bit of malice in the connotative meaning of using a slur or some other term. You can also look at what the action is. In the example that we're analyzing, we're talking about people being incarcerated. They are incarcerated. That is an action that is something being done to people of color. Whereas in the contrasting example, we're looking at the claim is that this is something that people of color do, something done by them. And so there's an implication of blame, right? That is absent in the example that we're looking at. Or I shouldn't say it's absent. The blame is not on people of color because it is something that is being done to them, not being done by them. There's also a difference in how we're phrasing the terms, right? To say disproportionately, as opposed to saying, well, despite making up only 13%. Saying disproportionately means that it is implying that it is the same in the sense that it is happening with a greater difference. Well, I'm trying to look for a word. I'm trying to look for a synonym for disproportionately, but that's the word. Is disproportionately happening to or by this group? But despite making up only 13%, it's like it's the implication in the counterexample is that there's a unique evil that's being done, like it's uniquely bad, as opposed to this is the fact of the matter that it is disproportionate. we're we're dropping some of the loaded language in the example that we agree with on the left here. There's also like implied implied information by pointing out that this is in the United States or that it's violent crime. These aren't analogous parts of the sentence, but they are parts of the sentence that have an implication that you are supposed to derive from it. And so the what is the implication of our sentence in question is that there are more people of color in jails and prisons is not due to the wrongdoing on the part of those imprisoned. It's something that they are incarcerated. They It is not that they have done something wrong. It's something is wrong being done to them. Implying that if laws were broken, those laws are unjust. And we have an impact. The reason why we should care is that the laws that led to and perpetuate this fact are racist and bad. But there's more to it than that. And this is where we get to values. Values are extremely important. This is what I was talking about earlier when we were talking about impacts and why they matter to us. What the impact is itself is because it tells you something about someone's values. There is a mistake you can make, which is to assume people have the same values as you. Do not do this unless you know the person, because people often have very different values. And if you assume they have the same ones, you're going to get very confused very quickly. But we have some values that are implied in that statement. This is just what was from the previous slide. But there's a value of anti-racism. There's the assumption that racism is, or maybe not the assumption, but there's the position that racism is bad, and we ought to combat it and its effects. I mean, I agree with that, sure. But if someone disagrees with that, if someone doesn't think that's the case, well, this argument's not going to work very well for them. That's what will lead them to making the counterexample. But the value of the person making the first statement, the one in question, well, there's some amount of implied anti-racism as a value. Additionally, I don't know if this is the right term for it. This is just the term that when I made this, I wrote it. I was like, all right, whatever. You get what I'm talking about here, which is the idea of legalism. That laws and morality should be or have some sort of play between them. That there are certain things that laws ought to be like and not be like. That is to say, people who have broken just laws should be imprisoned. What if you don't think that? Or that people that have not broken laws should not be imprisoned. As wild as it is, there are definitely people who believe that even if you haven't broken a law, you should be imprisoned. They're often authoritarian, or they just hate people or whatever else. But there are people like that, and understanding that this is something that the speaker for this example would think that people who have not broken laws should not be imprisoned. Well, it's important. And there's also the implication that people who should not be imprisoned if they have broken unjust laws. Right? If there's a law saying, for example, you're not allowed to carry an umbrella when it's not raining, that law is nonsense and stupid. And if I break that law, is it really reasonable to imprison me? I would argue no, and that's part of these values that are being expressed here. There's also a value of equality, that just laws ought to affect people equally, and that is one way of viewing a law as being just. But as we see from the example, the claim is that these laws are disproportionately affecting people on racial lines, and that makes them unjust. That the reason these laws are unjust is because of the inequality that they perpetuate. And all of this is in this one little sentence that literally just describes a piece of information. But the reason a person would think to say it and why they would even present that piece of information is how we get all of this. This is something that Jordan Peterson does a lot, and smarter people than me have laid this out more clearly. He will say a fact, but why he thought to say that fact implies to someone a conclusion that if you challenged him on, he would be like, no, I didn't say that. But he didn't. And of course he didn't, but he implied it. And the question of which facts you choose to present I shouldn't say the question, but the decision of which facts you choose to present implies an argument. And that's something you can also look for. Why did they point out this fact and not another? And so at the end of this, we get to the implied argument from our first example, which is that we ought to reform the criminal justice system because it is unjust. I agree with that. And that's what I was agreeing with when I said I agree with the statement in the outset. And that might have made sense to you from the beginning, but we didn't lay it out. And now, and maybe you didn't see that's the thing. Maybe you weren't thinking consciously that that's the thing you were agreeing with. And these kinds of things happen all the time. The actual thing you're agreeing with is completely removed from the actual statement made, but it's all in these implications. So at this point, I didn't want to remove the slide. There is a break here. This is for when I'm talking, but we'll talk with we'll check on chat. How y'all doing, chat? I see you there, Whisper Steel. Thanks for popping in. As I said, we're doing something a little different. This is a presentation I made to try to explain how to read an argument. Hope y'all are enjoying it. If you do have questions, I mean, I'll be popping in on chat periodically, but unfortunately, it is in a second scene. Cyber Sandwich asks, how come understanding the context for someone's belief in addition to their thoughts and arguments seems to be a big takeaway I got from the overview of sociology? Yeah, it's a big deal. And sometimes these things are like bigger than you can really handle in a conversation. The example I gave earlier of like your racist uncle or whatever, the reason that he says the things he said, like this is decades of impacts in like the society in which he grew up and yada yada, et cetera, and whatever. Yeah, like that's not you really can't do very much about it, but it's important to think about it and take that into account when you're hearing them speak and when you're responding to it. American History X, a phenomenal movie, is very good for pointing this out as well, because you see spoilers for that movie, which if you haven't seen, go see anyway. This isn't like that big a deal. That you see a lot of the like racist attitudes that the main characters of the film have seem to have derived from their dad. Like they just didn't really realize that this stuff was at home way earlier than they thought it was. Now it's a little on the nose. It's a little like blatant in that movie as opposed to how it would normally be, which is, very like a lot of subtle things here and there. But yeah, it's important. Like what brought a person to this point that they feel that this is something they should say. It's important to keep in mind. All right. That said, now we can move on to the second example. Oh, I already have it. This is the more intermediate example, and this is going to be something that we disagree with, or at the very least, I disagree with, and I hope you do too. Remember, in red is not the example we're looking at. This is the counter example. This is the alternative. In the question, in this case, we're going to be looking at a question. So what we're not going to be we're not focusing on here is, should trans people have access to the restroom for the gender with which they identify? This can be contrast. So notice it's a question. So note even questions can have arguments in them, and this one doesn't as much, but the actual example does. It's also absurd on its face, and we'll get to why later. I just wanted this to be here for when we get to the corresponding part of the actual example. And it's not normally presented in this way, is it? It's normally presented like this. And this is what we're actually going to be looking at. The question is often, should trans women be allowed in women's bathrooms? Like the first example, these don't ask the same thing. These are not making the same point whatsoever. Don't translate arguments for people. This is something really important. What I mean by this is actually not exactly what's written here. I don't know better how to express it. It's okay to translate arguments into terms that make sense to you, because oftentimes people use words in different ways, and sometimes there might be a way of expressing it that makes more sense to you. Okay, fine. But what you shouldn't do is translate an argument in such a way that it changes the meaning. If you hear the question in white, you should not think that it is the question in red. Now, I don't think a lot of people do that for this example specifically, but I do know that people do this a lot generally, where they think people are using words in a different ways than they're actually using them. And this is really, really hard to pay attention to. I've had arguments with people where I was using a term one way, they were using a term another way, and even though I was like making clear, hey, I'm using this term differently than you are, while I could operate with understanding what they mean when they say use the word, they were still assuming that when I said it, I meant what they mean by it. Don't do that. But this question is also absurd on its face. The reason why, again, we'll get to in a minute. So, I guess we'll get to right now. The question in the red is really asking if you agree, as I do, that trans people are the gender with which they identify, and they are. Then this question is asking, should women have access to women's restrooms? Which is why this question is absurd. Obviously, who, if not women, who should have access to women's restrooms? But the question in white is asking something else entirely. When this question is asked, the implication is often that they think trans women are men, which they're not. And so the question is, should men be allowed in women's restrooms? It's a question that you don't actually need to answer. It's rhetorical. And that's why these questions can be arguments, even though they're questions. You would think a question can't be an argument, but no, there's an implied argument here, which is that the answer should be no. And so we could ask about values. We're going to skip the obvious one, transphobia. This is not irrelevant. Bigotry is a value, and it's important to identify with people that you're speaking with. But it is so obvious that I feel like we don't need to discuss it very much. Clearly, the person who asked the question in white, they're a transphobe. But we can move past that because there's more going on here. One question is, who is the agent of action? We talked about that in the previous example, right? The verb in the sentence is allowed versus have. What that means is that the agent of action is us. There's an expectation of enforcement. We do and ought to permit access to whatever the thing is in question, and ours is to set the rules. This is implied right there in that statement because it's not asking if they should have access, which is a question of availability. It's if they should be allowed. We are barring them, and should we stop that? And it is our job to decide who should and should not be barred. It's all right there. But there's more than that. There's also gender roles that are present, like gender expectations and gender roles that are present in this example. Because we can ask the question, why should restrooms be separated by gender? It seems like a very normal thing in our society, but that might just be because we've all grown up with it. But if you take a step back and ask, wait, does that have to be the case? Why should that be the case? Well, there are answers. The answers are pretty gross, actually. The first is the less gross one, that women must be protected. Now, it is still gross. It assumes a lot of, it's pretty patronizing. It's infantilizing. But at the very least, it's this expectation of, well, you're worth protecting. It sucks, but there's a silver lining, right? There's also the implication that men must be stopped from doing evil. Is that if you don't protect women, men will do bad things to them. There is an assumption that men are just out to do harm. This comes up constantly. I know I've talked about it before on the channel, and it's something that I find absolutely repugnant. And it's something that I won't say isn't discussed, but I'll say I feel is under-discussed when we talk about the problem of gender roles. There's this idea that a penis is a weapon, and this is also very biologically essentialist. So the idea is men always have penises, which isn't the case. But a penis is a weapon, so a man is always armed, and he's trying to do harm. You have to stop them from going into the bathroom, because otherwise they're going to do some number of sex crimes. It's pretty shitty, right? But it's built in here too, because part of the assumption is you shouldn't allow men in women's restrooms because they'll do bad things to the women who must be protected. There's also an amount of magical thinking, which is that, well, the little sign on the door, if someone's going to do a bad thing, they're probably not going to be bothered by that. The question as to who can use restrooms, is not some magic force field that keeps predators out. It's not that, if you can imagine if you're watching a slasher movie and the final girl is running away from the killer and they run into a women's bathroom, you think the killer's just gonna be like, shit, can't go in there. It's just impossible. No, obviously not. But there's an amount of like this magical thinking of like this is a sacred barrier that cannot be breached, and if we allow Ben in, then suddenly the gates are open and the hordes can rush through. It's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. So we can take a break again. That example I have a lot less to say about. It's just not. Yeah, I don't know. I just have a lot less to say about it. Does anyone have any more questions? I'm gonna take a sip of my tea here. Talking about anti man bigotry. It does bug me. I'll admit. Good tea though. Okay. I'll see you questions in chat. So now we're gonna get to the final example. This one we do need a trigger warning for though. It involves Destiny. Brace yourselves. That said, no, that's mostly a joke. In this case, we're not actually going to be looking at something Destiny said. We're going to be looking at someone he was talking to said. This embed I've embedded a video. It has frequently not worked, but hopefully it will. It did when I was testing it earlier. And so now we're going to be talking about arguing with your racist uncle. This is a conversation, very famous one, where Destiny debated JonTron, and we're going to be looking at what JonTron said. Don't worry if this embed doesn't work. I have typed out what they said in the next slide as well, but let's see if we can get it and see what you can pick up on it. We're just looking at a couple of seconds here. Ooh, well, that's new and different. Okay, let's see if I can get it to go here.
Okay, I don't understand. But again, going back to the central question, you can't tell me what's so bad about white people becoming the minority. You still haven't answered that question.
I have answered it a million times. No people wants to become a minority in their own country if they don't have to. They shouldn't do it.
Okay, but
So, as brief as that was, that's what we're going to be looking at. Because there's actually a ton that goes into this. This is the best example. This debate is the best example I could think of where I could show how much is in someone's statement that they didn't say. And we're not going to fully analyze this and break this down, but we are going to delve into it a lot. So here's the exchanging question. Destiny says, going back to the central question, you can't tell me what's so bad about white people becoming the minority. You still haven't answered that question. And JonTron responds, I have answered it a million times. No people wants to become a minority in their own country if they don't have to. They shouldn't do it. So what can we take away from this? Well, first, let's see what we're talking about. JonTron obfuscates a little bit that he's talking about white people, but he still is. And he puts it as a more ubiquitous thing. No people wants this, but we're still talking about people, groups of people on racial lines. He just implies it without actually saying it. And he talks about what they want as being important. But why? Is there a reason why a racial majority in a country's desires about like racial demographics should have any sway? Like, let's say all the white people in the United States wanted to not be a minority, or wanted white people to be the majority. Now they don't think that, by the way. But let's say that were the case. Okay, but why is their will so important? Why should that interest of theirs be protected? There's also an implication here in their own country, making the claim that, yeah, the U.S. is the country of white people's country. It belongs to them. It is theirs. And to become a minority in your own country would be some great wrong. It's right there in what he's saying. He's saying they shouldn't do it. Notice the agent of action again. It is white people who should not choose to become a minority in their own country. Now, the reasons why they shouldn't want that, well, he talks about it in other parts of the debate. The short version is he believes that there's something about being a minority that means that you are at risk of of oppression in some way, kind of implying that that's the purpose of a majority. That's a good, a normal and natural thing, as opposed to people who think that, well, maybe you shouldn't criminalize human movement, and if people can live where they want, and if demographics change, so be it. No, I don't think well, I certainly don't, and I imagine most people who agree with that don't think that oppression should be a part of that. I think that shouldn't be, that no one should have to deal with oppression, minority or otherwise. But there's an implication that that should be the case. And talking about to become a minority as being very important here. I think I just talked about that, so I'll skip it. And then there's if they don't have to, that, hey, we can stop this from happening. We have the power, we can prevent it, and it is ours to do so. This is why things like this, statements like this, are why people said after the fact that, yeah, JonTron's a white supremacist. Because everything he says belies a white supremacist way of looking at the world. That this country belongs to white people. It is theirs to have. They should not become a minority. They don't want to become a minority. They don't have to. Therefore, they shouldn't. And the country's protection of white people as a preferred group should be codified in law, was more or less his argument. And this is where you can get that, like, yeah, this is pretty obviously white supremacist and white nationalist, even though he does not identify as such. When he made a video afterwards talking about this debate and just being like, oh, I'm bad at debate and whatever. Yeah, I don't, it doesn't matter how bad you are at debate. You won't say something like this if you don't have the underlying thoughts that lead you to it. This is what we're talking about, the how come and what for. It only made sense for him to say this if his mindset was one that included white supremacist thinking. And there's a lot more to go into here, but I'll leave you with this to like chew on. You can go, like, this whole debate is packed full to the brim with statements like this. Every time I've rewatched it, and I have seen it a few times now, I find something new, some new dog whistle or implication I didn't notice before. It is very rich with stuff to dig into and find all of the implied meanings in. And while I don't think this presentation does what I hoped it would, help you in like normal conversations, this is what I do on my channel. I know the person who asked me to make a video out of this said he wanted to show it to some people. If you're one of those people, anytime I do a debate review on this channel, this is what we're trying to do live in real time constantly. This is why I always rephrase arguments when people make them. It's not just to hear myself talk, though I know I do talk a lot. It is also because we're trying to do what this presentation attempted, but I think struggles with, which is to help you in a moment by moment basis understand what your friends or what the people around you are saying, often your friends or family, and correctly interpret their arguments. It's even gotten to the point where I have had arguments with people where I understand the implications of their argument more thoroughly than they do, and argue about that while they're sitting there being like, I don't think that. But obviously they do, because they wouldn't say what they did otherwise. Now, you can say like, oh, I'm just reading into things that aren't there. I invite you to watch the debate reviews on my channel and ask you if I'm tilting at windmills. That said, we'll let's see. Does chat have any questions? I don't see any there. We are gonna wrap up with this. This is just what I wanted to do today. I want this to be a self-contained video. If you found this useful or helpful, well, I'm very glad for that. I hope it was for you. If not, as I say, this is what we do every time I do a debate review on this channel. That's what I'm trying to do. Oh, thanks, Cyber Sandwich. I appreciate it. And I think that in the debate reviews we can much better accomplish what we're trying to do here, because we can take our time, take as long as we need at any point, go on at length in real time, and also see someone misunderstanding it. That's what I really wanted an example of. An instance of someone saying something, the other person misunderstanding it, and being able to bridge that gap. Why did that happen? Which I can't really do very much here. Even in the example from the JonTron and Destiny debate, Destiny was pretty clearly understanding what JonTron was saying. So it's not like even that happened there. It's just, well, at the very least, that was very dense with implied meaning. So I know it was really short today, but I just wanted to get this presentation out. So thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a great holiday, great rest of your weekend, all that wonderful stuff. I appreciate it very much. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you next time. Bye.